Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for jumping on board. And let's try this out. Be'ez Hashem, we're going to succeed. So the plan is that we're beginning tonight a new cycle. I believe it's the 44th cycle of learning the entire Rambam. And there's the main cycle of learning 3 chapters every single day, 3 prakim, which makes you finish in a little bit under a year. And another version of that, another variation of that, is to learn the daily Sefer Hamitzvos, which instead of going through the in-depth code of the Rambam, learning as Adar II, as Mishnah Torah, to learn the mitzvahs that correspond to that day's learning of Rambam, going through the Rambam's book called Sefer Hamitzvos, the Book of Mitzvahs. And we're going to be doing that. The plan is that every single day there should be a voice note, which is 2 to 5 minutes, generally speaking. Today it's not going to be that. Today it's going to be a lot longer, as I'm sure you're going to be able to see by the time you get this voice note. It's going to be a lot longer today. But between 2 to 5 minutes, and hopefully this will make it easier for all of us to learn Rambam every single day and to take part. And Sefer Hamitzvos is really a beautiful Sefer. I think it's a little bit underappreciated. So it's a nice challenge for me as well, and I'm happy that all of you are here. And Hashem should help us, that we should actually succeed, be able to do this consistently. And all right, and we'd love to hear from you, any feedback, thoughts, comments. Okay, let us begin. So we begin today with the introduction. We're not actually beginning to learn the actual Sefer Hamitzvos. That's going to start in a few days. But just like the main cycle of Rambam begins by learning the Rambam's introduction to his Mishnah Torah, the Adar II, to his Code of Jewish Law, learning Sefer Hamitzvos also begins with the Hakdama. And it's a very, very interesting Hakdama, very, very fascinating. So I'll give you a little bit of a summary, and again, it'll be a little bit longer today. For the next few days, it's going to be a little bit longer. It's a pretty long shir. But let's make this less than 10 minutes, hopefully. Okay. The Rambam says like this. The Rambam begins writing his introduction to Sefer Hamitzvos. The Rambam says, we just concluded working. The Rambam just completed his first real work that he worked on, a commentary to the Mishnah, the Pirush HaMishnah Yisrael Rambam. And the Rambam wrote that actually when he was very, very young. If I'm not mistaken, the Rambam began writing that when he was 23 years old. It took him a few years, but pretty amazing. The Rambam writes a full, very, very chashuv, a very thorough commentary on the entire Mishnah. And the Rambam then says that his next big idea, which is a natural next step after working on his Pirush HaMishnayos, is to work on a proper, real, authoritative, organized, exhaustive work of halacha that will simply have all of the halachas of Torah in a very organized, systematic way. Everything should be accessible, and the Rambam starts laying out this vision for what we know today as the magnum opus of Rambam, the Mishnah Torah, the Adar II. And it's very interesting to see how the Rambam is kind of sharing with us his vision before he actually wrote it down. And the Rambam says that the Mishnah is not perfectly organized, and there are so many gaps in the Mishnah, and there's machlokes, and it's hard to always know exactly what the actual halacha is. And therefore, the Rambam wants to make a sefer that just simply makes Yiddishkeit in its entirety fully accessible. A person should not have to know too much. There should never be any vagueness. Everything should be very clear. No matter what question halacha you have, it should be relatively easy to find the answer. The Rambam also discusses how he's going to organize it. It should be very, very systematic, highly organized, a whole different organization model than what exists in any other firm before him. And it's really beautiful to see how the Rambam lays out this vision. And the Rambam also says that what he wants to do in this upcoming big work that he wants to do, this Mishnah Torah, his code of halacha, of Jewish law, is he wants to have the list of all the 613 mitzvahs at the very beginning, and then at the opening of every single new section of the Sefer, he should have there which actual mitzvahs of the Torah are going to be covered in this section. It's like that the student who's going to be learning from the Sefer could follow along and see how we're slowly working through the mitzvahs of the Torah. And the Rambam says, and when I thought of that idea, I was reminded of something which really, really bothers me. The Rambam says it's something which has been bothering me for years, really, really bothering me. What's bothering the Rambam? What's bothering the Rambam is that people simply get what the 613 mitzvahs are wrong. Now, that's a very, very interesting thing. I think this isn't known enough, but it's such a fascinating idea. Everybody agrees that there are 613 mitzvahs in the Torah. The Gemara tells us that. The Gemara says 613 mitzvahs, and that is the official number. No one argues on that. But what are the 613 mitzvahs is actually is open for debate. And there's a lot of divergence of opinion there. What is counted as a mitzvah? When are two details counted as one mitzvah, or when are two details counted as two separate mitzvahs, etc., etc.? And that makes a very, very colorful scene of different opinions coming and saying, I have this count of 613 mitzvahs, I have a different count of 613 mitzvahs. Practically speaking, there generally is not any relevant difference between them. Like, no one's going to say this is not a mitzvah, but it's just for a matter of understanding the count. Is this counted as its own mitzvah? And what the Rambam says is that he really takes it up, and as we're going to see in the upcoming days as well, the Rambam really takes it up against the most famous and the most widely accepted version, and I think the first version of an official count of the 613 mitzvahs was somebody who lived before the Rambam, the Baal Halachis Gedolos, the Halachis Gedolos, the Rambam calls him, the Bahag. He's known as the Bahag, and the Bahag was a very early halacha sefer from the times of the Gaonim, from the Gaonic era. And the Rambam says that I really disagree, like deeply disagrees, with the conclusions and with the decisions that the Bahag reaches in what is a mitzvah and what is not a mitzvah and what is part of the count. And the Rambam says what bothers me even more is that later rabbis came and published their own versions of 613 mitzvahs, and they kept very, very close. They really did not deviate too far from what the Bahag wrote, as if what the Bahag wrote is the final word and you can't argue on it. And even if you want to divert a little bit and be a little bit more creative and disagree, but the Rambam says, look, everybody's scared to do too much, and he doesn't like that. The Rambam says he got it wrong. The Rambam is very clear that he totally disagrees with the Bahag. And the Rambam also describes how in his time in Spain, in the lands of Sfard, they were very big into piyutim, into these poetic songs as part of their davenings. We're more familiar of these piyutim from Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, but as part of the Sephardi culture, they were doing this on a daily basis, and they have all kinds of poetic songs that are part of their davening that make it an easy way to remember different fundamentals. And there were certain piyutim, or as the Rambam calls them here, azharot, which they would sing in the lands of Sfard, and they would go through in some poetic form all 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. And the Rambam says it just grates my nerves, it grates my ears every single time I hear this, because they're singing this song, what the mitzvahs are, and they're getting it all wrong because it's all based on the Bahag. And the Rambam says, don't worry, I don't have any problem with the people who wrote these songs. They're great poetists, they're great songwriters. It's the words fit perfectly, but their forte is not rabbinics. So they just followed whatever was accepted precedent of what the mitzvahs are. But they got it wrong, says the Rambam. And the Rambam wants to say, okay, therefore I'm going to first put out this sefer called Sefer Hamitzvos, and I'm going to give you the actual list of what are the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. But then the Rambam says, but one second. But the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah, if I'm going to put out a list, people are going to read it and they're going to say, well, look, the Rambam's wrong. Why is the Rambam wrong? Because look, everybody disagrees with the Rambam, so the Rambam must be wrong. And the Rambam is very bothered by this. And the Rambam says something so interesting. It's like an interesting commentary, even today. Not much has changed in 1,000 years. The Rambam says this is the problem with people today, that people just accepted wisdom. People just buy into precedents. People just buy into accepted narrative and don't actually think through the issues objectively. Come up with your own decisions. Think it through. But instead, he's going to say, no, the Rambam's wrong because the Bahag says differently and we just accepted Bahag. Why? No one knows. No one's ever thought it through. The Rambam's like, no, think critically. Which is so interesting, right? The whole idea that Rambam wants people to think for themselves. Stop just accepting because somebody said this is the list, that must be the list just because. And the Rambam says we have this problem even with Yechidis Gula, even with special people, even with big Talmidei Chachamim. They're very much following what the Bahag writes. They don't want to this. And the Rambam specifically calls out one, Let me see if I can find it quickly, who it is. One person, Harav Chayfetz Goin, the Sefer Hamitzvos of Rav Chayfetz Goin, Harav Chayfetz Ben Yatzliach, a wonderful name. And Rav Chayfetz was a Goin from the end of the Gaonic era. And Rav Chayfetz, he is a little bit more liberal with disagreeing with the Bahag, and he calls out some of the mistakes that the Baal Halachas Gedelos makes. But the Rambam says he didn't go far enough, and he wasn't willing to call out the bigger mistakes. And he actually makes his own mistakes, trying to correct the Bahag's mistakes. And most importantly, he's too scared to call out the Bahag's real big mistakes, more fundamental mistakes. So the Rambam says, look, so therefore what I'm going to do is I'm not just going to give you my list, I'm going to explain to you my formula. I'm going to tell you what I'm doing over here. And the Rambam is going to give us, and the Rambam is about to share with us over here, the 14 rules, the 14 principles, that if you'll just take these 14 principles and study through the Torah, you'll be able to determine yourself, following this logic, following this formula, how you reach the number 613, and which statements of the Torah are a mitzvah and which ones aren't, simply by having these principles. Really, really fascinating. And like this, the Rambam says, everybody will be able to see that I'm right, and people won't just automatically assume that I'm wrong, because they'll have the tools to be able to critically think this through and see that I have a rhyme and a reason to how I'm doing this over here. All right. So the Rambam says, here we go. We're going to do the Sefer Hamitzvos. And the Rambam says, I'm not here to give you an exhaustive overview of all the halachas of the Torah. I'm only here to give you a count of the mitzvahs. I'm not giving you the dinim of the mitzvah, the details of the mitzvah. I'm going to tell you what the mitzvah is. I'll share with you some general information that is necessary to understand the mitzvah and to understand why a mitzvah is called by a certain name. But even when I share details, the Rambam says, I'm not sharing it to share with you dinim, to share with you the actual law. If you want actual law, wait for my next book that I'm about to work on, the Yad HaChazaka, the Mishnah Torah. That's my code of Jewish law. That's exhaustive. That's authoritative. This is just a list of the mitzvahs. And with that, the Rambam says, let us begin learning the klolim, the shirashim, the general root principles, the formula that the Rambam himself used, a system of how to get to the number 613, which is going to be very, very interesting. The Rambam says like this. Let's begin learning the klolim. So number one, the Rambam says we all agree there are 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. This comes from Gemara, Masechta Makos, 613, 248 positive mitzvahs, mitzvahs aseh, which are corresponding to the limbs of the human body, 248. And there are 365 mitzvahs leisasa, prohibitive mitzvahs, which are corresponding to the days of the solar year, 365. And then the Rambam brings down from the Medrash a beautiful vart. The Rambam says that the Chazal explain the numbers and the symbolism of what they correspond to in a beautiful drush. The positive mitzvahs correspond to the 248 limbs of the human body, meaning to tell you that every single limb is screaming out to the Yid, do a mitzvah with me. There's a mitzvah for every limb, and the limb itself demands from a Yid, do the mitzvah with me. And there are 365 prohibitions against the 365 days of the solar cycle, the solar year, as if to tell you that every single day of the year is telling the Yid, don't do an Aveda on my day. So that's a beautiful drush that the Rambam brings in. Okay, the Rambam says nobody disagrees on this number, as we mentioned before, but how do you get to that number? What are the mitzvahs that bring you to that number, to 248 and 365? So the Rambam says here are the 14 klolim. Now, I'm going to read the klolim very quickly, as the Rambam says them, but you're probably not going to understand them. Maybe some of them you'll say they're obvious. Some of them you'll say, I don't even understand what they're saying. But they're all actually very, very deep and very important. And they're a bigger chiddush than it may seem like, as we're going to see in the future days learning. But for right now, I'll just tell it to you very, very quickly, and I hope I understand all of them correctly. Okay, so here are the 14 klolim. We'll go through them quickly, and then we're going to conclude. Number one, don't count any mitzvahs which are midrabanan. Any mitzvah which is not from the Torah, but were added on by Chazal later on, are not counted. Rule number two, any mitzvahs which are derived, they are not explicitly in the Torah, but they're learned out from one of the 13 principles of deriving halachas and mitzvahs from the Torah, don't count them either. So we don't count those. Number three, don't count any temporary commandments. The mitzvahs have to be l'dodos, permanent, for all of Jewish history, for all of eternity. Rule number four. Don't count general mitzvahs which apply to all mitzvahs. We'll get to a few examples of what that means tomorrow. Rule number five. The reason for the mitzvah is not counted as a mitzvah itself. That may seem obvious, but we're going to see tomorrow that that's actually not so simple. Number six. Any mitzvah that has both an aseh and a leis aseh, they are taught in the Torah, they're commanded in the Torah, both in a positive way and in a prohibitive way, they are counted as two separate mitzvahs, even though they're really both telling you the exact same thing. Rule number seven, the details of a mitzvah are not counted as their own mitzvah. Rule number eight, whenever there is a negative statement, don't consider that as a negative commandment. Again, that may seem obvious. We'll learn about that in 2 days. Rule number 9. Don't count every single time the Torah says a commandment. Count only the command itself. Some mitzvahs in the Torah, we're told about them more than once. Let's say 3 times. So that's not 3 separate mitzvahs. That's 1 mitzvah. Don't count the statements. Count the commandments themselves. Rule number 10. Don't count any introductory actions necessary in order to do the mitzvah as a mitzvah in itself. Number 11, if a mitzvah has different parts, don't count every single part separately. Rule number 12, if there's different actions as part of doing a mitzvah, don't count every part of the action as its own mitzvah. Number 13, a mitzvah and how many numbers that mitzvah is doesn't grow because it's being done for many days. Even if it's done for many days, it doesn't mean it's 10 mitzvahs. It's still just 1 mitzvah. And the final 14th rule is the proper way how to count the punishments of the Torah. The right formula how to count those. So we'll get to all this tomorrow and the next day that I'm just going to really walk us through every single one of these klolim and explain them to us, and which is very, very geschmack, which is really beautiful. And that is, wow, that's a long voice note. Okay, I hope I didn't lose you all. That is today's Sefer Hamitzvos. It's a bit long today, and we'll see you all tomorrow night, Be'ez Hashem, for the next Sefer Hamitzvos. Zai Gesund, thank you all for joining. We'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.